We are moving right along in this particular course, and this week we're going to start looking. Y'all calls this democracy in America, but I've titled this presentation "Rise of the Common Man," and what do you see down at the bottom? But it's a picture of Andrew Jackson, and historian Arthur Schlesinger many years ago talked about Jackson as a symbol of his age. Sometimes we call it the age of Jackson or Jacksonian democracy or the Jacksonian era. And when dealing with this period, you cannot get away from Old Hickory in this time. And so what I'm going to do here is to provide you with the first half of it in a lecture format. But one of the things, there's some times where the YALP is not the best textbook in the world, but in this chapter, it does an absolutely fantastic job with Jackson. And if you read that and you go through the other PowerPoint that's on there for this week, then you're going to get a great overview of this period, and we're doing an excellent job on the discussion board and anything that may show up on the midterm. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about here is change being afoot, because by the time you get to this period, by the time you get to the post-War of 1812 era, change is happening. And if you read through all of this right here, and you can download that PowerPoint as well, but it starts basically 1821-ish. I mean, we can argue with where that is, but in 1821, we still have a politics largely dominated by what I've called here deference. And this is not my term. This is a different textbook's term, and I like it because after the vitriol of 1796 and 1800, now we've kind of settled down just a little bit. And there were really no other competing parties. And you look at that, voters deferring to the leadership of local elites or leading families. I mean, this is something that happened well into the 20th century. Political campaigns are not very fiery, unlike what we're seeing right now. And one of the things that you never saw at that time, or very rarely saw, was the candidates trying to drum up voters. They like to believe that the voters chose them, that they didn't go out and appeal for those votes. Well, that's gone out the window today. Again, election procedures being very undemocratic. We'll see how that happens and what changes there. There were tax paying and property owning requirements in most states, and in most states it was only adult white males. Though there are exceptions and some very notable ones that kind of show how American democracy is always evolving. Electors being chosen by state legislature. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, but there's going to be changes that come out of this period. You're looking at a time when less than 30% of adult white males could vote. It's going to be much different by the end of this time period in roughly 1836 to 1840, depending on where you want to call that end. So, oh, look at there. It did say 1840. But what we've got here is that this revolution takes place in American politics. Those property qualifications and most things are going to go away. Voting by voice is eliminated. Now let's think about that. If you go to the polling place today, you don't have to sit there and give your party affiliation or who you're voting for, though my superintendent had something kind of silly like that happen during the primary the other day. I would have been dumbfounded. They'd have been taking me out, or the sheriff would have been taking me out if that had happened to me. But there's going to be some type of ballot process, though not a secret ballot. That's not going to happen until much later. But voting by voice is going to go away. You have a lot of direct methods for electing presidential electors, which is what we do every 4 years, and all that kind of stuff. So voter participation is going to jump. Okay, it's going to jump. We'll go from 30% in 1820, 21-ish to about 80% of adult white males, which again, that's only a portion of the population, but it's the 80% of that is a much bigger portion than we had before. So what you're going to see is democracy evolve and become more democratic. And that is going to be one of those core concepts, and one of those core things that happens in the United States is we become more democratic with a little d as this country moves along. Now, and I promise you we'll get done with this big giant narrative here in a minute and have a few other things, but you were looking at, in that post-War of 1812 era, a one-party system. We call it the misnomer of the era of good feelings. But now America tends to like two parties. We don't like three, we don't like five, we like two. You go to some other countries and they have to form coalition governments because they have so many parties. Well, in America, we like to have two. I mean, we make fun of them and they go back and forth on things, but we like to have two. And that expanded electorate is what did it. You replace that politics of deference and deference to elites and deference to, these political, I was call them bosses, and all I can think of is Boss Hogg from the old Dukes of Hazzard show, until all of a sudden this expanded electorate, people want you to court their vote. And you go by the listen to me, 1830s, you've got two big national parties, and they have philosophical differences, which is going back to that, late 18th century to the election of 1900 kind of thing, all the way through the War of 1812, and now we've got one. Wide popular appeal in every single state. Professional party managers. Have y'all seen enough of those lately? All of this partisan newspaper speeches, parades, rallies, what we would call barbecues or cookouts, all of that is so close to our modern system that most of us believe that our modern political system was born right during this time. And so now we need to see, where does this fit into the time scope and the sequence of American history? And so we go back to 1801, boom, there it is. Jefferson becomes the third president, with that election of 1800 and the revolution of 1800. And we kind of ends 1836 when Jackson pulls a George Washington and pulls a Jefferson, and he steps down after 2 terms. Now, Martin Van Buren's going to carry it on for a few minutes, but 1836, 1840, somewhere in there is kind of the end. So we begin this period, at the end of the War of 1812, and we finish it up around 1836 to 1840. All right, and so by 1820, suffrage begins to expand to include all white men, and I say all, and as a huge, painting with a huge brush, but we're getting there. And some people say, oh my goodness, that's so awful, it's terrible, it's limited. Yes, to our perspective, it is. Absolutely. In the 21st century, we never stand for that. But in the early 19th century, this was a step in the right direction. And then you get the election of 1824, which is really going to kick this period off in a big way. It's going to create a whole host of problems. And then that corrupt bargain that's going to happen in 1825 when Jackson's going to lose the election, even though we're going to see some numbers that say he should not have, and he thinks that there was some backdoor dealing, smoky back room kind of deal, that the fix is in, so to speak, it's rigged. Then you hit in 1828, he wins that election. He wins it, resoundingly. He's going to maintain that for a while. And in 1829, you got his inauguration, which may be the biggest party of all time that Washington, D.C. has ever seen. And so you get these events that are happening, and they're moving along, and you notice how this period of time marches along from like the end of the War of 1812 all the way until Andrew Jackson stepping out of the White House. Now, so what are the causes of this new democracy? There's some pressures on the one-party system. The first is there's some pressure, okay? And that pressure comes from New England has industrialized as a result of the War of 1812. And again, some of Jefferson's things that he would have never wanted to create an industrial country, but he helped start it. And then you've got, what's his name with the cotton, Eli Whitney down on Katie Green's plantation down in Georgia. Katie Green, the wife of Nathaniel Greene, one of the greatest generals of the American Revolution that you've probably never heard of. But anyway, in her plantation, he invents that cotton gin, which allows cotton cultivation to absolutely explode throughout the South. So now we've got pressure because you've got an industrial North and you've got an agricultural South. In very different ways. I mean, you're looking at some big time industry in the North. You're looking at massive cash crop agriculture in the South and the rise of what's going to be called King Cotton later. And then there's some party identification issues. Depending on where you are in this country may determine who you identify with. In Northeast, it used to be the old Federalist. Now, who's it going to be? In the Northeast, they believe in a strong central government or a strong national government. In the South, it's the old Jeffersonians, and they've always been suspicious of government's power. Wanted a limited or a weak central government, and all of this is going to create havoc until we get to the period of the American Civil War, which is at the end of this course. But this isn't going to stop until then, and it's really not stopped today. And you start to look at the expansion of this nation. If you look at the darker pink color there, that's American 1783. And then all of a sudden it goes to the Mississippi River by the Treaty of Paris. So we've got the pink colors are going to be America as originally established. Then by 1802, you remember Lewis and Clark and during the Jefferson administration and the Louisiana Purchase. So we're stretching all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so as this country gets bigger, you have more room for different ideas and more regionalism in those politics. And then you look by 1820 now, we've got Florida down here, we've got some little areas up there, and you can see my very crude attempt at blocking off part of this image because it wasn't designed for what I'm using it for. But the country has grown exponentially, okay? And as things grow and change like that, you're going to get new ideas that are come to the forefront. This is why the democratization or this rise of the common man, so to speak, or this Jacksonian democracy, we may want to call it, is so important because it is the result of all of this expansion and these changes in the economy and society. Now, so how do we expand voting rights? Okay, it's going to happen, all right? So the abolition of property qualifications is huge, okay? Because it allows people who do not own anything to still be allowed to vote if you are a white man. One of the fellows I used to teach high school with for years, he said, Brown, I'm not sure if I should be allowed to vote, which is just us making fun of things, right? But that is the most significant innovation because now it's not tied to, being of some kind of wealth or means. That's a big deal. And then that panic of 1819, and if you've done your law reading, you're going to see it, that led many people to demand that end of those property restrictions, not only just on voting, but on office holding as well. Because now they're like, you know what? We can't rely on this unfettered economy and economic growth to do that. It's just some people may have simply hit on hard times and bad luck. And so by 1840 here, universal white male suffrage was largely a reality with only three, there are three states. Yes, there are three. Louisiana, Rhode Island, and Virginia, they restricted to white male landowners and taxpayers, okay, that's a whole separate issue right there. But only three of the states at that time restricted it. So you can see democracy has expanded a great deal. It ain't I'm going to use it ain't what we would call real democracy today, but it's a lot better than it was just, a few years before this. And so now we've got to encourage people to vote, okay? So how do you do it? Well, they've got to think that there's something to vote for. All right. So in this case, we statewide nominating conventions, which is what we're going through right now in America. And maybe if I use this video later, people will be like, "What do you mean?" Well, we're in the middle of a primary season. You open up more polling places. That is huge. You've got to make it convenient for people to vote. Extending hours at the polls. I think in North Carolina, they're open till like 7:30 at night. They open at 6:30 in the morning. I mean, that's amazing. I rolled in after work. I had been gone to a workshop all that day. I rolled from North Wilkesboro all the way to Shelby and was still able to vote and then go get dinner and come home. So you extend those hours. That voting by voice, people may not know who you voted for, and that's big. Because just depending, you don't want to make political enemies by voting, quote, the wrong way. So this made it easier to vote your conscience as opposed to vote how you were expected. And but if you look at each party having a different colored ballot, and you look at, oh, everybody's going to know, and that's true. But if people can't read or write, they don't know whose name's on there, the different colors will let them know. And you deposit in a publicly viewed ballot box and all that kind of stuff. So depending on how it's done, you could still know how somebody voted, but it was a little bit harder than it used to be. So you take all this together, there's a lot more participation. And so then, who could vote? We talked about white male suffrage, right? That's not all. Because in most states, if you're a white male over 21, you could do it. But like today, where we talk about, oh, we have illegal immigrants coming in and all they're voting. That's not anything new. Um, if you look here, immigrant males who claimed they intended to become citizens, they'd be allowed to vote. Okay? In most states, including here in North Carolina. In other states, women could vote, like New Jersey. New Jersey, if you were unmarried and you owned property, it means you're head of the household. You could vote. Now, that's an interesting little quirk, because if you had a son and that son turned 16, you were no longer head of the household. Now, when I was 16, my mom and dad both alive and married to each other. But when I was 16, my mama she was the head of the house, and I'm 53, and she's probably still head of the house. But in New Jersey, that could happen. So if your husband passed away, that property legally went to you because you did not have a son of legal age to own it. You could vote. So a lot of women would not get remarried for that very reasons. You had some legal rights that you had never had before. And in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, free African Americans could vote. Okay, that's not something we're necessarily expecting right here. So when you look at it, not only have almost universal white male suffrage, but you have a lot of immigrant male suffrage. New Jersey, you have some form of female suffrage. In New Hampshire, Massachusetts, you have free black suffrage. The males, obviously. This is more democratic than it had ever been before. Now, to us, it's still stifling, but to them, it was incredibly liberal and progressive. So the question I have there, and I would always ask this if we were sitting in class together, is are we seeing an increase or a decrease in democracy? And I think this right here is pretty self-explanatory. We are seeing a huge increase in democracy in this time. So what does it mean, right? So you get this new democratic idea of politics, and I should have used that all lowercase. You see sometimes how I type when I put this together back 2010. But you get this new democratic idea, and it should be a lowercase. I don't mean Democrat in terms of party. Now, what we've got here is politics it must express the will of the common person. Okay, at that time they would have said common man, hence my terminology there. But politicians had to cater to the masses. This right here was something that people who went before them did not have to do. And I liken this back to a scene in the movie Gladiator when one of the senators, Falco maybe, I can't remember. Anyway, he comes to the games and he says, "I'm not a man of the people, but I try to be a man for the people." That's what we're looking at here. You have got to be. And even, if you look at politicians, even when I was growing up in the 80s and in college in the early 90s, you saw. There's one in particular. I will never forget the commercial. He was trying to prove he was a common man, and he went to some kind of lumberjack competition and was trying to chop wood. Had on a flannel shirt, had on blue jeans that had never seen the outdoors before. He was trying to chop wood, and we were just horse laughing him because you could tell man had never used an axe before. Because if you have, when somebody's using one wrong, and it was just kind of goofy. We were like, he's going to cut his foot off, but that's part of it. You got to be a man for the people and act like you're of the people, and that means you got a campaign that's like with barbecues or what we call cookouts in North Carolina, free food, free alcohol. Okay, this is at a time when alcohol is far healthier than the water. All right, but people still would get drunk. Anything you can do to woo voters, you would do. All right. So what we consider normal today was brand new back in the 1820s and 30s. Which leads us to the first big election with this stuff all kind of in play, the election of 1824. And so what you get is John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. Sometimes he's called a Yankee misfit, but that's okay. Smart kid. If he's the son of John Adams, he's going to be smart. You got Henry Clay, and he's not going to go away till almost the end of this class. You got Henry Clay in the West. You got John Crawford in the Deep South, somewhere down in Georgia, though he's going to... It's either he dies or he nearly dies right around the time of the election. I'm pretty sure he died off and was actually dead when ballots were cast. But you've got him in the Deep South, and you've got Andrew Jackson, who's the wild card, because he's sitting over in Tennessee, over near Nashville, and he's a combination of the South and the West. So we don't know how this thing's going to play out just yet with Andrew Jackson in it. Because again, remember, you've got to appeal to the people. And since there's no television, all that other fun stuff, how do you appeal? Well, you're going to be regional candidates almost. But remember, Andrew Jackson has got his fame at the Battle of New Orleans, and the fact that he whooped the British, right? But so we don't know how it's all going to go. And the question is, what does this tell us about the changing nature? It is becoming very regional, almost localized. And there's this old saying that all politics is local, and that's exactly right. That's exactly what's starting to happen here. And it's who is going to best represent enough people to get themselves elected. So this is almost a political free-for-all during this time period. And so what is his appeal? And this is from his memorandum. This is stuff that he wrote back, in the early 1820s. And when you look at it, you say, oh, this is how old Andy J., this is how he appeals, First of all, the bank and the debt are corrupting influences. Andrew Jackson had gotten, what's the story? Oh my goodness, I'm sitting here at my kitchen table. I can't remember the exact nature of the story. But he had put some money in the bank, and then had gotten out paper money, and all of a sudden the bank closed down and the paper money's worthless. So he thought these banks were nothing but crazy things. And he said, this national debt, why are we getting in debt? He says, like people being in debt, and all of a sudden it's got awful. Now we're going to have to pay all that stuff off, and it's going to cause various taxes here and there. Pretty popular little mantra. He says, you know what? This government's getting too big, and it's corrupt, and it's the same people, and it's the rich people, and it's the elite people, because Andrew Jackson's not an elite, and it's snuffing out liberty, because these people are in charge of it, and they're going to make sure that nothing ever good ever happens to you. And see what happened to me back when I was younger. And like, how do you fix it? Well, our virtuous citizenry. I'm going to use his own language there. That good, solid, everyday people with common sense can fix this bad boy. And so, in order to do that, government has to be subject to the will of the people. And you can't see will because it's sitting behind my head on this thing, but it's got to be subject to the will of the people. Folks, this will appeal to a lot of individuals today, but this is in the 1820s he's writing this, so he's really appealing to folk. And so the election happens, and who wins? Well, you can't see Henry Clay's House vote because it's behind my head, but it's okay. You look at old J.Q. Adams or old John Quincy, and he 113,000 votes, 84 electoral, boom. Andrew Jackson, 151,000, 99. Jackson wins the election. Wrong, because nobody got a majority. Okay, you must get a majority. Now, why do you think you see 271 on everything when you lead up to an election? Because it takes 271 electoral votes. That's more than half to win it. And so what happens here, Crawford, I mean, the man probably ain't even alive at that point. Henry Clay, Henry Clay sitting around, the great compromiser, we're going to call him later. But they play into, because if you take those electoral votes out, what is that, 78? All of a sudden you got 78 votes in play. So neither John Quincy or Andrew Jackson, either one, have enough. So it's got to go to the House. And when it gets to the House, which is what is prescribed by the Constitution, when it gets to the House, and this ain't the last time it's going to go to the House, when it gets there, all of a sudden, that's when he talks about the corrupt bargain. People sold him out. He said he was rightfully president of the United States. He got the most popular vote. He got the most electoral votes. He was rightfully president, but he wasn't, because the Constitution doesn't work that way. And so all of a sudden, the Crawford votes and the Clay votes, people are vying for those back and forth in the House. And in the House, each state gets one vote. And here, they're not one, it's one or two votes. Anyway, there's a limited number. Yeah, it's one vote. And they're back and forth with this. How are we going to do it? And all of a sudden, Andrew Jackson, the man with the most popular appeal, the most popular votes, the most electoral votes, is sitting at home, and he is not president. And so you begin to look at this, and you start to look at the nature of this, and you start looking up there at John Quincy Adams in that little crazy pink or salmon color, and you see where his stronghold is. It is in the Northeast. There's a little bit over in Illinois. There's a little bit down in Louisiana. Why, I've got no idea. But you see it up in New England. When you see Jackson, he's kind of scattered across the country. I mean, Tim, you see there's some Henry Clay. He's out there a little bit in those orangish areas, but you see how this thing breaks down. So all of a sudden, Jackson calls this a corrupt bargain because he got the most, yet he got nothing in the end. I mean, it's kind of like that scene in Caddyshack. You'll get nothing unlike it. He got nothing, but he didn't like it. So you break this thing down by the House of Representatives, and there you go. Okay, now we can see how this deal gets done. One vote per state, 54% of them go to John Quincy Adams. What deals got cut? Don't know. Look at what North Carolina did. We went with old Crawford there. So this gets a little bit weird. So Andrew Jackson's got to go back home to Tennessee with nothing to show for it. He didn't even get a copy of the home game. And so you get some really neat cartoons. This is a lot better than the crazy memes we have floating around now. And this one I'm going to try to zoom in just a little bit. And on the left there's John Quincy Adams, there's Crawford, there's Jackson. They're sprinting for that finish line, right? I mean, this is pretty cool. It's a heady little, thing right here. And on the right, you got Clay pulled up short and stands on his head. And then he's talking about, all this kind of stuff. And there's some funny imagery here if you can read the little thought bubbles that are of his head. So don't distress yourself. There'll be some scrubbing by and you'll get a chance. What that is alluding to the fact that yeah, you didn't win it on this vote, but where's some more dealing to be done? There's some more backs to be scratched. There's some more horse trading to do. And here you can see part of that a little bit better. And on the next slide, I try to zoom in on the other for you. There it is. Don't distress yourself. There'll be some scrubbing by and then you'll have a chance. And that's part of that backdoor dealing that Andrew Jackson thought, from his earliest forays into politics was ruining this country, that these elites set it up for themselves and themselves only. And this is just, to his mind, further proof that you can steal an election. It's not like we haven't heard that here lately, is it? I mean, we still hear things like that, whether it's true or not. We still hear it. Was it true in Jackson's case? Probably not, but I see where he's coming from. I think it's pretty easy for us to. So there it is. This is from Margaret Baynard Smith as part of her writing, who she happened to be in several cool little spots to be able to overhear from it. And if you download the PowerPoint, you can see that. And it talks about some of the dealings that went on. What I'm talking about, it's impossible to win the game. The cards were stacked. I mean, there we go. Stolen election. That's not something that happened like 2000 in Bush v. Gore. It's not something that happened in 2020 with Trump and Biden. Listen, we went back to 1824. We've been hollering this 200 years ago. Now, what happens here? Think about this. January 1824, the House vote hadn't even happened yet. And John Quincy Adams he's inviting Henry Clay to come visit him. This looks bad. It may not be bad, but it looks bad. We don't know. They didn't leave a record on whether they reached a deal or not, but it just looks bad. You can't have things look bad. All right. And so, Clay had made it known that he was supporting Adams, and all of a sudden Clay becomes so he gets a cabinet position. And so Adams wins. And again, this is why Andrew Jackson calls it a corrupt bargain. He had the most votes, he had the most electoral votes, and all of a sudden this schmo's in the White House and Henry Clay gets a big fat position. Now, the two parts of it aren't enough. Let's go to a third part here. So if you download it, you can read through it. So the point of the whole thing is you can see what Andrew Jackson's talking about. Was it corrupt? No, it followed the rules. We don't know what Clay and Adams talked about, but no matter what, Andrew Jackson's won. Like I said, the man with the most votes in the Electoral College and in the election gets sent home. So how does this, I've spent enough time yakking about it, how does this impact the country in 1824, besides making Andrew Jackson mad? He's not a guy you want to get mad. First of all, this idea of an illegitimate president, that's not a modern concept. Okay, it's at least 200 years old. Okay, and they're going to overstate their case and they're going to argue it just like we see today, and that's all right. All right, but it doesn't matter. So what happens is when Adams takes office, there is a significant piece of the population that believes that he is not truly the president, that has been taken from somebody else. And Jackson is now, he gets to come back and say, listen, let's see what they have done to me. I'm a man of the people. They don't want you in control. They want this overeducated man whose daddy was president. They want him to be president. It's all about that lineage. All right. So that equals Adams and his company, they look guilty. Whether they are or not doesn't matter. They look it. And when you look guilty, that's part of that public opinion piece or that public image piece. And now with candidates having to play to the wills and desires of the masses, this is going to be a problem for John Quincy Adams. So what happens is we have a party split. Okay? So what you end up with is John Adams on one side, Andrew Jackson on the other. So Jackson's going to run as a Democrat, whereas you're going to have a Democratic Republican in John Adams. So you get a split again, just like we saw early on in American history. Or sometimes they maybe call themselves National Republicans instead of Democratic Republicans. It gets weird as to what some textbooks want to call them. And then that name's way too close to some other stuff, so they form the Whig Party later on after the Jacksonian period. They become the Whigs. And that ends a one-party system, gets replaced by a two-party system right out of this election of 1824. Then what you start to see is all kinds of different court cases in the Marshall Court. We saw Marbury versus Madison last week. And if you download the other PowerPoints, you're going to see similar, like a steamboat case, a bridge case, a this case, a that case. And all of that in the Supreme Court is going to play a big role in a lot of the Jacksonian pieces. As a matter of fact, Jackson's going to defy the Supreme Court at one point, and that's going to be okay, because there's no way for them to enforce it at that moment in time. But, there is, in the Constitution, there's an enumeration of powers, and it says this is what the government can do. And there's one group of people that says if it says they can, then they can. If it doesn't say they can, then they can't. And so there's some argument back and forth about that type of what we call construction or interpretation. And in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, it is about that right to regulate commerce and about the right to regulate interstate commerce in this case. Right? So they continue on with this idea. Who can regulate interstate commerce? It can't be the individual states. It has to be the federal government. Right? Does that sound good to everybody? Because it should. Okie doke. Because if so, could you imagine North Carolina versus South Carolina or whatever? It doesn't work that way. And that's what was starting to happen is, you have the Jeffersonian idea of a weaker national government, whereas John Marshall on the court is able to construe their rulings in such a way to preserve the power of the federal government, which further locks in Jacksonian animosity and further locks in this idea that the fix is in to a lot of people. Now, you can read through all this in that previous slide if you download it, and that's okay. But that we start to see that the Supreme Court becoming into its own and becoming a true third branch of government at this time, trying to hold back some of the Jacksonianism and trying to support some of the old federalism and create a workable federal government. But all it does is plays into Jackson's hand because, hey, you got the guy who looks like an illegitimate president. Hey, I'm the guy who was the people's choice. This rule by the elite. This guy's daddy was president. He's been educated at all these big universities. Here he is. He didn't even win. Now he's president. Hey, you got this court. What are they doing? They're not elected by anybody. We got now our party is split. And then Rachel Jackson, oh my goodness, the Yelp does a better job than I ever can of talking about the problems that poor lady had. Talk about an innocent getting caught up in a bunch of mess. That's exactly what's going to happen. Her and Peggy Eaton are going to get caught up in a mess of political scandal and intrigue and nastiness. That's the only way to put it, is nastiness. So you definitely want to read that part because it is very, very interesting. But what this does is it plays into Jackson's hand. He looks like he's been wronged. They're wronging his wife. They're doing these things. It's this elite. They're going to keep doing it to you unless something's done about it. Now, the real problem was not the issues in 1824, but it's like almost every other election. It's about the personalities involved. Okay, and face it, today we can get a real glimpse into the personality of candidates. If we pay attention to news clips and other things, we get a real glimpse inside of them. And people that are not likable, we tend to not vote for. And with this case, John Quincy Adams was what one historian has termed a Yankee misfit. I mean, he's something different. He criticized for dressing slovenly. That can be me. His wife was from England. Okay, whatever. Clay, he's presented as a worthless drunk. I mean, Clay liked his liquor. He liked to gamble. He liked his liquor. Who knows about the Crawford guy? I mean, he's about dead at that particular time. Jackson, they called him a murderer because he fought one official duel that we can find. Now, though he probably did fight more. So these personalities kind of play into it. And Jackson is able to leverage his backwoods, foundation, from the Waxhaws down here on the edge of North and South Carolina, all the way to pulling himself up by the bootstraps, so to speak, and becoming a self-made man. Whereas John Quincy Adams, his daddy had always been part of the wealth and the power elite of this country. And so some of that and the quirkiness of John Quincy Adams really plays into Jackson's hand. So if you're John Quincy Adams, your administration, Lord have mercy, it's not going to be very smooth at all, much like his father's. Part of me kind of laughs at it a little bit, but in reality, it's kind of sad because we don't really know how good of a president John Quincy Adams could have been. John Randolph from Virginia was one of the worst at criticizing him. Lord have mercy. Clay being Secretary of State, how did he get there? Did he make this deal with Adams? And as you can see, he's not going to last very long. If we go back to that timeline, you can see he's only going to be a one-term president. He's only going to be a one-term guy, and then Jackson's going to take what he and his followers think is his rightful place at the head of this government, and can turn it back over to the people, which is going to lead to a lot of fun. He's going to have problems with his own, Vice President John C. Calhoun. He's going to have problems with secession. He's going to have problems with the bank and Nicholas Biddle. He's going to have, problems with this rotation in office or the spoils system. He's going to have problems with using his veto. They're going to have King Andrew. Matter of fact, this T-shirt that I've got on right here, if you can see the back of it, it's got that cartoon on it that you see in the Yawp. But the Yawp does such a good job with this. Whoever wrote this chapter did an excellent job. And so that's why I want to make sure that you do read this. I'm not going to cover all of Andrew Jackson. We're just going to get through this Adams administration, because in 1828, here comes Andrew Jackson, and he's coming, and like in the movie Tombstone, Heck's coming with him. So in conclusion, this age is typically called the age of Jackson, which plays into your discussion board, because I think he's an apt symbol for the period. That doesn't mean that's correct, okay? But this increased democracy that occurred spurred the change in American politics. He just happened to be the man at the right place at the right time. And he's become rather famous, and now maybe even vilified in some ways for it. So we got a change in politics from a rule by a quasi-elite to a system where politicians have to respond to the will of the people. It is very, very different than what had come before, and it has a huge impact on what comes after. So please make sure you read the rest of the Yawp, because they do an excellent job laying the Jackson presidencies out.